Long before the age of cowboys and frontier towns, another powerful nation stood in the forests and valleys of the Northeast. Among the most respected of these nations were the Mohawk. They were known as fierce warriors, skilled hunters, and guardians of their homeland. The Mohawk were one of the founding nations of the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, an alliance that united several nations in a system of leadership, diplomacy, and mutual defense that had endured for generations. Their villages stood along the rivers and forests of what is now New York, where they protected the eastern gateway of the Confederacy and earned the title Guardians of the Eastern Door. As European powers arrived in North America, the balance of power across the continent began to shift. Trade alliances formed and rivalries grew between empires seeking influence over the vast lands of the New World. In this changing landscape, the Mohawk became important allies and formidable opponents, depending on the conflict. Their warriors learned to adapt to new weapons and new tactics, while maintaining the traditions and discipline that had defined their people for centuries. During the growing tensions that would eventually erupt into the American Revolutionary War, one leader rose among the Mohawk, whose name would become known far beyond the forests of his homeland. That leader was Joseph Brant, known to his people as Haudenosaunee. Brant was not only a warrior, but also a diplomat who understood both the world of his people and the world of the European settlers. He spoke English, traveled across the Atlantic, and witnessed firsthand the political forces that were reshaping the future of the continent. When revolution began, Brant faced a difficult decision shared by many native nations. The conflict between the American colonies and the British Crown would determine the future of the land itself. Believing that the British alliance might better protect the territories of his people, Brant chose to stand beside the Crown and led Mohawk warriors and their allies through the long and violent struggle that followed. Riding through forests, rivers, and frontier settlements, Brant became known as a determined leader who fought to defend the sovereignty and survival of his nation. To some, he appeared as a feared enemy. To others, he was a symbol of loyalty, courage, and resistance in a time when the fate of entire nations was uncertain. Like the cowboys who would later ride the plains, the warriors of the Mohawk were shaped by the land and the responsibilities they carried. They were not legends because of stories alone. They became legends because they stood for their people when the future of their world was at stake. The war that reshaped the future of the continent would also change the destiny of the Mohawk people. When the fighting of the American Revolutionary War came to an end, the world that had existed for generations in the valleys and forests of the Northeast was no longer the same. The British Crown had lost the war, and the new United States began expanding into lands that native nations had long called home. Because many Mohawk had stood beside the British during the war, their position in the new American Republic became uncertain and dangerous. Villages that had once thrived along the Mohawk River were abandoned or destroyed, and many families faced the painful decision to leave the homeland their ancestors had protected for centuries. Under the leadership of Joseph Brant, many Mohawk families traveled north into British territory, where new lands were granted along the Grand River. There, new communities were built and a new chapter of Mohawk history began. Others remained in their traditional territories and continued to defend their identity and traditions, despite the growing pressure of a changing nation. The land had changed, but the people endured. The Mohawk nation did not disappear. Their language, their customs, and their memory of the forests and rivers of their ancestors continued through the generations. In time, the frontier itself would move westward, beyond the forests of the Northeast and into the vast plains of the continent. There, a different kind of legend would rise across the open land. Riders would guide cattle across endless horizons, and frontier towns would appear in the dust of the expanding nation. But long before the age of the cowboy, another kind of warrior had already walked these lands. The warriors of the Mohawk and the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy had defended their world with courage, discipline, and loyalty to their people. Their story remained part of the deeper history of the continent, a reminder that the land where legends would later ride had already been shaped by nations whose strength and identity would endure long after the battles of their time had passed. Today, the story of the Mohawk did not end with the wars of the 18th century. The nation endured, and its people continue to live across communities in both the United States and Canada. In the early 21st century, historians estimate that there are more than 40,000 people of Mohawk descent living in North America, preserving the traditions of a nation that has existed for centuries. Many Mohawk communities were formed after the American Revolution when families followed their leader, Joseph Brant, north into British territory. One of the largest of these communities grew along the Grand River in Ontario, in what is now known as the Six Nations of the Grand River. Today, this remains one of the largest Indigenous communities in Canada, with tens of thousands of registered members and a vibrant cultural life that preserves the traditions of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Other important Mohawk communities continue to thrive across the northeastern region of the continent. The community of Akwesasne stretches across the border between Canada and the United States, and today includes more than 13,000 registered Mohawk members. Another historic community is Kanawa, KE, near Montreal, where Mohawk families have lived for generations while preserving their language and traditions. Through the centuries, Mohawk people adapted to the changing world while maintaining their identity. Many became famous for their skill as high-steel construction workers, building the skylines of American cities. Mohawk workers helped raise some of the most iconic structures of the 20th century, including bridges and skyscrapers in New York. Their reputation for courage and balance at extreme heights became legendary among ironworkers across the continent. Today, the Mohawks still call themselves Kanyen Kahaka, which means people of the flint. Their language, ceremonies, and cultural traditions continue to be taught to new generations. The forests and rivers, where their ancestors once defended their homeland, remain part of their history, but the nation itself lives on through communities that continue to preserve the identity of their people. The warriors of the past may have fought on battlefields and along frontier rivers, but their descendants continue the story in a different way. The Mohawk Nation survived the storms of history and remains a living people whose legacy still shapes the land where their ancestors once stood.